I'm Emily Chang, and this is the best of Bloomberg Technology, where we bring you all our top interviews from this week in tech. Coming up, a criminal probe into Facebook now includes a grand jury in an escalation of the investigation into its data sharing practices. We will cover the growing list of controversies surrounding the social network. And both sides of the aisle are taking up the issue of breaking up big tech, but breaking up is hard to do. We'll talk about Washington's new tech agenda. And our exclusive and wide-ranging conversation with former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair on the global tech landscape. First, to our top story, the U.S. Justice Department has broadened its investigation into Facebook to include a grand jury, signaling an escalation in the ongoing federal probes of the company's data sharing practices. Plus, sudden departures of top Facebook executives. CEO Mark Zuckerberg announces that Chief Product Officer Chris Cox is leaving the company. Zuckerberg made this statement, which he shared with employees before it made it to the public. For a few years, Chris has been discussing with me his desire to do something else. He is one of the most talented people I know, and he has the potential to do anything he wants. But after 2016, we both realized we had too much important work to do to improve our products for society, and he stayed to help us work through these issues. At this point, we have made real progress. Zuckerberg also announced the head of WhatsApp, Chris Daniels, is leaving as well. This, of course, not the only issue Facebook is facing this week. From about noon Wednesday into Thursday, users were unable to access the social network and its related services globally, including Instagram, Facebook Messenger, and WhatsApp, in what turned out to be a massive outage as federal investigators launch a probe into the social network's data sharing practices. Thursday, we discussed all things Facebook with Techonomy founder David Kirkpatrick and Bloomberg's Sarah Frier.
You may not have heard his name as much as you've heard of Mark Zuckerberg or Sheryl Sandberg, but he is like the soul of Facebook. He does the orientation for new employees every Monday. He's in charge of all of the products,
and he's
Facebook,
in
Instagram.
Inner circle.
Well, absolutely. But even more than that, he created the news feed. I mean, he's the guy who is really the face of this product internally. So it is a big, jarring change for Facebook employees.
Now, in his own statement, Chris Cox said, "For over a decade, I've been sharing the same message that Mark and I have always believed. Social media's history is not yet written, and its effects are not neutral. It is tied up in the richness and complexity of social life. As its builders, we must endeavor to understand its impact and take up the daily work of bending it towards the positive there." So he's clearly alluding to the big existential issues that Facebook is facing right now. But why do you think he's really leaving? Is he leaving because he's fixed a lot of things, or is he leaving because he couldn't fix a lot of things?
Well, also in that post, there's another little line that says they're entering this new era of product development that is going to be focused more on encryption and apps that are connected, and the messaging is so private that not even Facebook can see it. He says Facebook deserves executives to take Facebook into that era who are excited about that change. So he's sort of hinting that he's not excited about that change.
Let's talk about Chris Daniels, the head of WhatsApp, leaving. And interestingly, Zuckerberg saying he's not filling Chris Cox's position, but he is sort of elevating the heads of each of these products: WhatsApp, Facebook, Messenger, and Instagram. Tell us about Chris Daniels, the head of WhatsApp. He's leaving too.
He's leaving too. So Chris Daniels was formerly the head of Internet.org, which was Facebook's, Zuckerberg's personal project to try to get more people on the internet, sort of connected to WhatsApp in that it was very international, but running a messaging product is a very different ordeal. We don't know exactly why he left, but it's a very difficult time for WhatsApp right now because they're facing all this scrutiny from governments around the world. There have been WhatsApp lynchings in India, all this misinformation that has spread on WhatsApp that is encrypted, and so Facebook can't really do much about it except for change its rules. So that would be a very difficult job to do.
All right, David Kirkpatrick is joining us now from New York. Of course, David, you wrote the book on Facebook. I'm sure you interviewed Chris Cox several times in that process. What do you make that he is now leaving?
Well, I agree with everything Sarah said about his centrality to the company. I mean, he has, in my mind, been in many ways the person closest to Zuckerberg from a product standpoint, which is why Zuckerberg gave him oversight over Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. I mean, that basically he's been running all the products. I also think it's interesting that he should be leaving and Daniels, who runs WhatsApp, leaving. Just a few days after Zuckerberg declares essentially that WhatsApp is the center of the new Facebook. So to me, it bespeaks some degree of conflict and disagreement. How much is hard to say, but clearly someone like Chris Cox would not be leaving now with Facebook so under fire just because, you know, he's tired after 13 years. That's not what would happen.
Which reminds me that when Mark Zuckerberg released that memo about privacy last week, he actually talked about getting new leaders on board and the challenges of getting new leaders on board who would be aligned with this new mission. Perhaps this was an allusion to him knowing that Cox and, you know, perhaps Daniels as well, David, would be leaving.
Well, one way to interpret this, you know, so many people have questioned the sincerity of that memo from last week, or week before last, whenever it was. My time is missing. But this actually suggests that really Zuckerberg is making a dramatic change and making it fairly fast. That's another possibility, and as Sarah was saying, maybe it really could be that it's not in Chris Cox's wheelhouse, and he wants to leave because of that. I mean, it's very shocking, though, to me, to see those two guys leaving at the same time. Daniels, too, is on the inner circle. So
now let's talk a little. This is on the same day of this massive Facebook global outage, which is believed to be the biggest outage that Facebook has ever had, which affected all of its services and perhaps is evidence of, you know, the power of Facebook being concentrated, you know, all in one place, but also the difficulties of managing that.
And especially when you have these different services get more and more integrated, right? You have WhatsApp, you have Oculus, you have Messenger, you have Instagram, and then Facebook itself. And yesterday they were all down, not to mention the ads manager, the service for serving ads on Facebook. Advertisers were telling me that they couldn't see their campaigns and how they were running. And it gave them the sense of, like, is there really an alternative?
Right. We were just showing him a map of the outage there as of noon today, and Facebook has said it's resolved the issues. There are, you know, a few hundred reports still of people without service, but if you looked at that map yesterday, it was red all over. This is a heat map. David, do you think this, as Mark Zuckerberg is also planning to merge the infrastructure behind WhatsApp and Instagram and Facebook Messenger, do you think this is, you know, just an isolated incident, or is it a symptom of a larger issue at play?
Well, I think Facebook has said so little about what actually happened. We're left guessing. One of the strangest things about it was that it wasn't just the blue Facebook, it was also Instagram, parts of WhatsApp, even Oculus. That is extremely surprising to me that they should have an architecture that would, at the moment, allow them all to somehow be connected enough that they could be simultaneously impaired. And it does underscore the risks of making it all one big integrated system, which clearly is happening.
Coming up, our exclusive and wide-ranging conversation with former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, discussing the role of big tech on the global stage. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. This week, I caught up with former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair about the role of tech in government as he wrapped up a tour here in Silicon Valley. I started by asking him about an op-ed he wrote in TechCrunch, where he said, quote, "Populists of both left and right have risen in prominence, and in their search for scapegoats to sustain their success, tech is now firmly in their firing line." Take a listen to why this concerns him.
Politicians exploit people's anxiety about the pace of change and the accelerating pace of change. They see these big companies, these wealthy people who run them, and they target the companies and they target the technology as something that's going to disrupt. and change our lives in ways that we can't control, and it's basically a bad thing. And my view is that this technological revolution is a fact, but in any event, it's essentially a good thing, but we have to deal with its consequences. But if it's handled in the right way, it can change our lives in good ways, and it can offer enormous opportunities, and it's up to politics to address how we access those opportunities and mitigate the risks, because it will also, for example, displace jobs.
You also say that the first politicians who master the tech revolution will decide what the future looks like. How so?
Because I think if I'm right in saying this technological revolution is the 21st century equivalent of the 19th century industrial revolution, if I'm right in saying that, then look back on what the 19th century industrial revolution did. It changed the way people lived and worked. It changed the relationship between the countryside and the city. In the end, it changed the laws. It changed politics. It changed everything. And this will be the same. So the first politicians that come along and understand it, master it, make sense of it, and show how this can form a narrative of the future that is essentially optimistic, those are the ones that will succeed politically.
So Democratic presidential candidate, U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren, has just proposed breaking up the biggest tech companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon. I assume you don't agree with her proposal, but what do you think?
I don't agree with her proposals, but I think it's a really interesting speech. And, to be fair to her, I think it's a speech with an intellectual coherence to it, and I think what it shows is, I think, where the Democrat platform may well go, and exactly the same issues are going on in the UK and Europe, that there's big tech. Personally, I think a better way of dealing with it is to regulate them through actually having a regulator for these large tech companies, because I think if you try and break them up, I'm not sure that really works. I think if you try and slice them up, you'll find enormous difficulty in doing that. And it's important always to understand that one of the reasons these companies are so large is because they're offering a service people want. So yes, there are huge questions that arise out of their dominance and their power, but I think it's a better way to regulate this in a way that has the public interest put into the mix when we look at these companies in a sort of structured way than think that you're actually, if you cut them in three, you're going to create a competition.
So what does that regulation look like to you? And should the U.S. take the lead of the EU, which has been pretty tough on big tech?
Yeah, but I think it's less about sort of being tough or not tough. It's working out what the right way to do it. And one of the other things we suggested, by the way, is that it would be sensible, particularly given the huge competitive power of China in AI, particularly in time to come, it would be sensible if Europe and America worked together on this.
How so?
Because if you created a more level playing field between Europe and America, you would actually you would give people the opportunity then to develop technologies of the future. It would allow these companies, not these big companies, and they're big enough already, but other companies to grow. And I think it would be very sensible to have a kind of transatlantic alliance on regulation of tech for the future. But the purpose of it should not be to hit them or be tough on them. The purpose of it should be to represent the public interest, because obviously there are public interest issues that come with this. And the sensible thing, rather than trying to decide each of these issues by either, as I say, breaking them up, because I'm not even sure that would destroy their monopoly power. If you broke them up, you might just find you have created three monopolies, not one.
Do you believe they're a monopoly?
Well, they are powerful. Let's say they're, if you take Facebook, Google, Amazon, they're incredibly powerful. They're likely to become even more powerful in time to come. But I think a better way of doing it is to look at it in terms of, say, how do we have the public interest into this? So I think these companies, where I think Elizabeth Warren is right, is that they are like utilities, right? They're utility platforms. And so, in the same way when, electricity and the water industry and other things were created in the 19th century, and they were created first in the private sector, in time people said, well, look, these are utilities everyone depends on, so they're going to have to be publicly regulated. In some cases, people even went to publicly owned. But the point is, if they've got that amount of power, there will be a demand from the public that the public interest is taken into account. But I think a better way of doing that is to have regulators that work with those companies rather than break them up.
So Facebook, for example, multiple scandals, compromised the data of millions and millions of people, many apologies. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO, has now said, we're going to focus on privacy, we're going to focus on private communication. Is that enough?
Well, I understand why he wants to do that, and privacy is obviously an issue, but I think the central question for all of these tech companies is power. It's their power. I mean, they are powerful. You know, if you look at their dominant position in advertising, or if you look at the role Facebook inevitably will play in politics today. Now, what I think is, in a way, absurd is to sort of say to them, you've got to be responsible for everything that's happening. Right? The truth is, it's a joint responsibility. You know, we have a public interest in making sure that they exercise their position responsibly, but we're going to also have to work with them to share that responsibility from the public policy point of view. Because many of these questions, you know, whether it's hate speech or incitement, or, so for example, radicalization or child pornography, whatever it is, these are things that obviously there's a public interest in sorting out, but that public interest is going to require not just those companies to behave responsibly, but government to be alongside the process of that and making sure that it's done in the most effective way.
So how can we trust the companies to understand and live up to their responsibilities? And similarly, how can we trust government to not, you know, be mired in this political process as we see in both the UK and the US, and actually do something? Right,
so this is a challenge, but you know, in the end, the challenge is best addressed, I think, by a concept of public interest regulation, and whether you do that for one for each individual company, you might, because there are different issues that arise, for example, in relation to Facebook or Amazon, Google. There are quite different questions that arise. But this is the world we're living in. But you know, there's a bigger question, which is then what happens, you know, for example, if you take driverless cars, and so the next generation of cars are likely to be electric and in time driverless. So this is going to change employment, it's going to change transport, it's probably going to change insurance. It's got a massive series of implications.
That was my exclusive interview with former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. Coming up, by 2025, India is set to be the world's third largest economy, and venture capital firms are anxious to get in on that growth. What trends investors are seeing in the country's rising tech scene? Next. Plus, Google power struggle. New court documents show co-founder Larry Page worried he would lose control of the company in 2011 and delivered what one director called a veiled threat to quit. This is Bloomberg. On Monday, Nvidia agreed to buy chipmaker Mellanox in its largest purchase ever. The deal for the Israeli manufacturer is worth just under $7 billion. And despite the size of the deal, it is still smaller than the top 4 semiconductor deals of all time. The move is expected to help Nvidia push into a market for data center components and meet the need for greater processing power across networks. Bloomberg tech Ian King and Bloomberg managing editor for U.S. Deals Elizabeth Fournier gave us their reaction.
To hear it from Nvidia, data centers in the future are going to be not just a group of computers, they're going to be all one big computer, basically. So the interconnects between all those individual components become more important.
And you spoke to the CEO last night.
That's right, and that's where Mellanox comes in, because they do the interconnects, and that's why it's important for Nvidia to get hold of this.
Now, Elizabeth, how does this fit into broader movement we're seeing in the chip sector? There was a big wave of consolidation in the industry, which seemed to have stalled up to this point.
That's right. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, semiconductors were the kind of hottest name in M&A. There was a huge amount of consolidation, a lot of it led by that sort of Avago Broadcom push. And, you know, companies tried to do similar things last year. I'm sure you remember Broadcom Qualcomm, and then the NXP deal that fell apart. And what's happened is, you know, people have tried to do big deals, and they've really been pushed back by regulatory concerns. So what we see now is a shift to some of these smaller deals, which, as you said, this is a big number, but it doesn't rank in that top 5 deals.
Ian, is this deal going to be subject to regulatory scrutiny?
Well, if you looked at what happened with the share price today, Mellanox was up, but it didn't go up to the offer price. That's a sign that people are concerned that, particularly in China, it's going to face that kind of regulatory scrutiny, which could take a while.
So, Elizabeth, in terms of what else could be in the pipeline, would you say we should be looking for deals, but smaller deals?
I think so. I mean, we know that this was a competitive process, that there were other bidders around this till the end. So we can assume that they're still looking for similar bolt-on things that they do. And, you know, Ian's the expert in this area, but we know that there is a lot of the sort of $1 to $5 billion companies out there that are potential targets.
Ian, you hear everything in the chip sector. I mean, what kind of chatter are you hearing about what could be coming next?
Well, I mean, the logic hasn't changed, right? There are still a number of companies out there that just frankly aren't big enough. The costs have gone up. They're okay, they're doing all right, they're reasonably profitable, but they're just really not big enough to stay competitive long term. One analyst note today said Cray Computer are in a similar kind of business. Maybe they're the next one to become a target here. But there are a lot of companies that are arguably subscale.
And Nvidia beat out Intel. What does that signify?
That signifies that they wanted it more than Intel did. It wasn't just Intel, according to some of our reporting. There was, you know, a number of other companies were interested, and that may have prompted this deal to be announced when it was, you know, regardless of whether it's going to be, you know, an easy process in approval or not.
So, Elizabeth, what else could be in the pipeline that you are watching?
Well, in terms of tech, the big thing we've got our eye on is obviously IPOs, and a lot of those can go down the M&A route. But I think in semiconductors, as Ian said there and you talked about, Intel was the name that lost out here. Maybe we look for them to do something different as an alternative.
Bloomberg's Ian King and Elizabeth Fournier. Well, India is coming online at an exponential rate, growing from 200 to 500 million users in just 3 years. And investors are jumping at the opportunity to be part of that growth. Since 2015, Lightspeed India Partners has raised 2 new funds totaling $310 million. And with 6 partners across its Delhi and Bangalore offices, it has become one of the largest VC teams in India. Bejul Somaya, a partner at Lightspeed India Partners, joined us Tuesday to talk about growth there.
We started investing in India as Lightspeed actually about 12 years ago. And then as the opportunity opened up, we decided that we would start dedicated funds for the region as we saw mobile growth really exploding and leading to the internet growth that you just spoke about.
So the growth in India has been astounding. I mean, 20 million people online in the year 2000. That might be 700 million in 2020. So how do you even begin to assess the opportunities? I mean, are they just exploding, or is it pretty obvious where you should be putting your money?
No, it feels like it. And I think what's changing is at the same time that you have internet growth exploding, you have now a cycle of repeat entrepreneurs in the market that are forming from some of the more scaled companies, and you have more and more risk capital available. So you have the intersection of multiple different things happening. Macro tailwinds are strong. That's leading to a lot of opportunity. And I think that what we're beginning to see and what we're excited by is that technology is making its way into every industry. So it could be commerce and retail, hospitality. One of our companies, Oyo Rooms, is doing a great job there. Logistics, ride sharing, transportation, media. So a lot of the things that we've seen in other parts of the world, in other large digital economies, is beginning to happen in India.
Big U.S. e-commerce and commerce companies like Amazon and Walmart have taken an interest in India. You know, Amazon has invested billions of dollars. Walmart bought Flipkart, of course, in a big coup.
Yes.
And those businesses combine logistics and e-commerce. How has their arrival impacted your job?
Yeah, I think it's a net positive thing, because for us as early stage investors, we want to build companies that ultimately will get public or will have some form of exit. So the idea that there is downstream capital or strategic investors or buyers for these companies is a good thing. One of the things I often say about India is it's an open market, so it's the world's next big digital economy. It's open, and what that means is now capital and interest is coming in from all over the world. So it could be the US and US strategics. There are Chinese strategics and investors that are getting very active, folks like Naspers. So there's capital flowing in from all parts of the world. I think that's good, provided it's ultimately used in the right way.
Lightspeed India Partners, Bejul Somaya. Coming up, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren continues targeting big tech, why she thinks breaking up U.S. tech giants could sustain market competition next. And Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Democratic presidential hopeful Senator Elizabeth Warren is going after big tech. After laying out her proposal to break up big tech on Medium last week, Warren took her arguments to the annual South by Southwest festival in Austin, Texas. She told an audience of many tech entrepreneurs that breaking up companies like Amazon and Google would keep the marketplace competitive.
That opportunity to do what you do best, to come up with a great idea, to work your heart out to make it happen, to be able to compete on a level playing field is taken away by these platform giants. So my view is break those things apart and we will have a much more competitive, robust market in America.
Bloomberg's executive editor, Tom Giles, as well as Bloomberg's Susan Warren, who covered the parade of Democratic presidential candidates at South by Southwest, joined us on Monday to discuss.
She put a lot of thought and time into this. There's a couple different prongs. One of them very, straightforward: break up big tech, break up some of these mergers. For example, Facebook bought WhatsApp, Facebook bought Instagram. She talked about Amazon and Zappos. So she's got a list of deals that she would take a closer look at. And she's invoking AT&T back in the 1980s and some of the big trust-busting cases in U.S. history. But there's also a more nuanced argument, and that's where when these companies start to operate like a platform, like a utility, and they're also competing as part of that platform or with those platform participants, that's where she also is looking for some kind of way to separate out those businesses. So, for example, Amazon. Amazon is a case that she keeps coming back to time and time again. That's a case where Amazon has created this huge marketplace for millions of sellers to go and peddle their wares, but Amazon is also a competitor in there. And she cited actually a story.
Right, Amazon is selling its own batteries,
That's
selling
right.
its own baby wipes.
White labels, exactly. And I just noticed that she cited our colleague Spencer Soper, a story that he wrote about a couple of years ago, where once Amazon sees that your product is starting to gain traction on its platform, it's gaining, popularity, Amazon has a way of creating its own white label version of that and creates this competitive atmosphere for its marketplace participants.
Now, on stage, she talked about Amazon, Facebook, Google, and in an interview with The Verge, she added Apple to this category, and she said, Apple, you've got to break it apart from their app store. It's got to be one or the other. Either they run the platform or they play in the store. They don't get to do both at the same time, so it's the same notion.
And you could imagine, there's got to be an interim step where, maybe these proposals start to gain traction. And maybe instead of actually a full breakup, you see a company like Apple potentially maybe getting out of some of the businesses where it is allegedly competing with App Store participants. That could be an interim step. Another interim step, for example, would be, paying closer attention to the ways that Facebook, for example, operates and spreads information, and maybe forcing them to be a bit more transparent about who is funding a particular advertisement, who is behind a particular piece of information that's being circulated around Facebook. People have talked about kind of treating Facebook and Google, for example, more like traditional media companies. So there are interim steps.
Meantime, Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's also running for, or announced she's running for president, said she wanted to see an investigation to see if breaking up tech companies is the best option. Susan, how were the other candidates received at South by Southwest by this tech-savvy crowd?
I think everyone was, all the candidates that I heard speak were very interested in seeing more regulation over the tech companies. None of them went as far as Elizabeth Warren in proposing a breakup, but they were open to just studying this question, looking at what needed to be done, closer scrutiny of the mergers, maybe even a little bit of retrospective regulation of mergers was proposed, and just overall solving this problem that nobody anticipated having 30 years ago.
Tom, have we heard a reaction from any of these tech companies so far on this?
They're not saying a lot.
We know they're lobbying in Washington.
They have good reason to lay low on this one. Look, the fact that these proposals have come out this early in the campaign shows that this issue is not going away.
Bloomberg's Tom Giles and Susan Warren there. Meantime, ads for Warren's campaign making her case got taken down from Facebook and then quickly restored. In response, Warren tweeted, Curious why I think Facebook has too much power? Let's start with their ability to shut down a debate over whether Facebook has too much power. Thanks for restoring my posts. But I want a social media marketplace that isn't dominated by a single censor. She got an unlikely supporter in Senator Ted Cruz, who retweeted Warren, saying, "First time I've ever retweeted Elizabeth Warren, but she's right. Big tech has way too much power to silence free speech. They shouldn't be censoring Warren or anybody else, a serious threat to our democracy." So what would a big tech breakup look like? Roger McNamee, Elevation Partners co-founder and author of Zucked, joined us Wednesday to weigh in.
I really like what Elizabeth Warren is doing. To be clear, she first reached out to Tristan Harris and me back in the summer of 2017 with her early thoughts relative to what was going on in technology. And I was incredibly impressed by the insights that she had in comparing what was wrong in tech to what she'd seen go wrong in the banking business, where essentially you had markets in which one side had vastly superior information and was able to control the information available to the other side, and where people who made markets were also participating in them. And so when this thing came out, I've studied it very closely. And I believe antitrust is essential in two different ways. First is the big tech companies, really I'm talking about Google, Facebook, Amazon, are blocking competition from startups in their immediate area. They're basically causing innovation to come to a stall in and around the core internet. And they've been amazingly successful at this. And I just think that's a terrible idea. I want to end that. And Warren is very much on that issue. And antitrust, it's a super pro-growth way of doing that. Historically in tech, starting in '56 with the AT&T consent decree, through IBM, the second AT&T breakup case, Microsoft, you've seen massive new industries created by using antitrust to stop the incumbent from dominating new spaces. So I like that. I also like the notion of preventing companies, the topic we were just talking about relative to Apple, companies that operate markets from also participating. Google and Facebook do this in advertising. Amazon does this in its marketplace. And I just think that should stop. I think the cross-subsidies and cross-sharing of data are also really, really bad. And I believe that Warren's proposal is a first step down that, and I'm very supportive. I recognize the people who point out that the history of tech, was misinterpreted in some of the statements that came out there. I really couldn't care less. And the reason I couldn't care less is because I think the issues in tech, the power situation, the dominance of the public square, the manipulative technologies that people are using, the surveillance that is now pervasive in our lives, that's just bad for society, and we should not allow that. That the new tech companies are a little bit like they're kind of like the companies of the early 20th century, the robber barons, so Standard Oil and JP Morgan and all.
I should point out, Roger, that there's no real breakup threat under today's laws and under antitrust precedent. So a lot of things would have to change. A lot of lawmakers would have to get on side. Do you see a better argument to break up Facebook or Google or Amazon or Apple? Which one of those four companies do you think presents the best case that serves Elizabeth Warren's argument?
Let us be clear, right? This is a position. There's no guarantee we finish there. But you want to start with a position that says we're going to do something really dramatic. We may be open to finishing somewhere else. And this is where I agree with both Senator Warren and Senator Klobuchar. And I think both of these two really understand this issue. And, whether you break them up or not is less important to me than you prevent them from operating in ways that stall the economy, which is what we've got going on right now. I think you can achieve some of this without breaking them up. But the threat of breaking them up is the way you get them to the table to have the conversation that we need to have. And I just want to be super clear about something. I'm really excited about the strides we've seen in the Trump administration, particularly in the Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. In my own conversations with them, what I've found is that these are people who understand that there is something really wrong with what's going on in tech right now, and that antitrust is the most pro-growth way of dealing with that. And they are the antitrust tools in the regulatory toolbox. And both of them are doing things right now that are a big, big change from what we've seen in antitrust under the Obama administration or before them in the Bush administration. So I look at this and I don't think this is going to be partisan. I think this is a right versus wrong issue, not a right versus left issue.
That said, Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, these are 4 different companies. Yes, they're all tech companies. Yes, there are some overlapping businesses. But do you think any one of these is more a sort of culprit or a target than another?
Well, I think Google is by far the most effective at this, right? They had this insight in 2002 that, you know, when they were trying to improve search, they would gather all this data, and they discovered they only needed about 1 or 2% of it to improve search. So they went looking for what they could do with the other 98%, and they discovered they could use it to predict behavior. So then they go in and they do Gmail because they want to find out who these people are. And with Gmail, they set up so they could machine read all the emails, which would tell them what people's behavior was going to be, because people would tell you an email. And then they wanted to know where they were, so they created Google Maps, and then they start things like Street View, where they drive up and down the streets taking pictures of everybody's private spaces. And then, you know, they do the satellite version of that, and then they do Google Glass, and now you've got Google Home, right? So you're putting audio into everybody's houses, and they're basically taking away all of our privacy, where privacy is defined as our ability to make choices without fear and without being exposed by others. But they're also taking away our pricing power, because they manage our access to information just as they manage the access of anybody who has something to sell. They manage their access to consumers. And essentially, they're centralizing the whole economy in the hands of Google, number one, then Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Verizon. They're the 5 guys who are at the core of that strategy. And let's face it, it's a brilliant strategy. I just think we need to have a conversation as a country. Why is it legal for corporations to own and trade our most private data? Why are they allowed to buy and sell and trade our credit card transaction data, which they get from, you know, Experian and Equifax and TransUnion? Why are cellular companies allowed to sell our location? Why are health and wellness apps allowed to sell data that if it were a hospital they wouldn't be able to sell? Why, you know, are any internet companies allowed to sell our our passage history, our search history online?
Does Apple stand out to you from the rest because of
Apple
their stance
clearly,
on privacy?
Apple's not perfect, right? A lot of what they do in China I object to, but what they're doing in this area, I think they're fantastic. And so the reason why I have mixed feelings, and I'm kind of hoping that there's a way for them to avoid the antitrust problem, is because I think Apple is trying to be a good guy, and they've really succeeded.
Roger McNamee, co-founder of Elevation Partners and author of Zucked. Coming up, Larry Page's quest for power. We look at how he has fought to make sure he doesn't lose control of Google. Next. And later, NASA wants to return astronauts to the moon, but it will need the private sector to get there. We will discuss the role of startups in the agency's Moon to Mars program next. This is Bloomberg. Nearly 21 years ago, Larry Page and Sergey Brin founded a small search engine that we all now know as the behemoth Google. Since then, it has become one of the largest public tech companies in the world, with a market value of more than $830 billion. And with any company becoming public comes the threat of founders losing control, something a board member described as a, quote, real concern to Page. In fact, according to confidential emails and other documents recently unsealed in a court case, we know how badly Page wanted to keep his grip on his creation. Why should I sacrifice and work so hard if I might not be in control? That's what Page allegedly told a former Google director, Paul Otellini. Lawrence Cunningham, professor at George Washington Law School, and Bloomberg Tech's Mark Bergen weighed in.
In these court documents, we don't really have Larry speaking at all. There is a deposition from Sergey, his co-founder, but around this time, Larry had just returned, Page had just returned as CEO. So he was CEO at the beginning, right? The board brought on Eric Schmidt as a sort of adult supervision. He comes back, he goes to visit Steve Jobs that year, asks him, what does it take to be a good CEO? He goes, reads all the books about good CEO, and he's trying to pivot the company in a big direction. Sergey, meanwhile, is going into Google X. So this is the beginning of self-driving cars, the early days of Google Glass. We talked to people involved then that had said there was always tension between the two, but it's always sort of a healthy tension. What these documents show is that at times it maybe wasn't, and Larry was concerned that either Sergey or Eric would sell their shares, perhaps leave the company, and then an outside group would have a controlling stake.
Eric Schmidt. So what the founders wanted was the creation of a new class of shares, of non-voting shares. They already had these Class B shares, right, with 10 votes per share that Larry, Sergey, and Eric had, and votes for regular shareholders, shares for regular shareholders that had 1 vote. Right?
And the initial plan, they said, I think it was December, around Christmas, they're like, we'll get this done in 3 weeks. And the board actually pushed back for over a year, and there was this back and forth, and this lawsuit actually demonstrated there was a much bigger pushback than what a lot of people knew.
Ottolini expressed concern about Page's threat, and the board ultimately created a committee to look into whether these shares should be granted. Larry, what do you make of how Google's board handled this situation?
I'm impressed by how the board handles this situation. Pushing back against stockholders who have a controlling stake thanks to a dual class structure is not easy. So I was impressed that they pushed and insisted that Larry explain exactly what he was up to. I mean, after all, if he was merely concerned about ordinary dilution, they could just avoid issuing stock. They could use cash for acquisitions, or they could purchase stock back. So they pushed hard on him, and he essentially admitted that his main concern seemed to be that if Sergey Brin were to sell his stock, then Larry would lose the joint majority control, and he was very concerned about that. And issuing the C no vote stock would solve that problem. If he could trade his C to Sergey for the B and can retain control. So I think the board uncovered that and did a good job.
Now, Mark, the board still decided to start this new class of no voting shares. Why, despite these concerns?
We saw John Doerr as a good example, the legendary VC here in Silicon Valley. He's been a board member for a long time. He originally was against the proposal. There was one of the depositions that said that he changed his mind. In part, he was convinced that it was the best way to recruit talent, right? This is a huge concern at Google and has been historically about recruiting the best, most talented engineers. I think
So keeping Brin and Page engaged would help recruit talent.
Yeah, and this is about the time they're about this year they make the biggest $12.5 billion acquisition of Motorola. Page has these big plans that he's come see to fruition, right? Of Alphabet, of self-driving cars, of biotech, of healthcare, all this stuff that didn't exist at Google in 2011, and now these much grander moonshots and areas and moving to different fields that arguably couldn't have happened if the founders didn't have such tight control of the company.
Meantime, when you give founders this much power, there's always the risk of them perhaps making not great decisions. And Larry, we've been covering another story out of Google where Page himself personally approved a $150 million payout package for Andy Rubin, the creator of Android, who was accused of sexual harassment, and permitted this guy to leave the company quietly and then invested in his next company, also paid another Google executive, Amit Singhal, $45 million, also accused of sexual misconduct. Where was the board then?
Well, if true, both of these examples show the downside to dual class. I mean, the proponents of dual class argue that the founders' vision and their long-term outlook warrant that kind of control. But here, to the extent that and the downside is that you sacrifice some accountability to shareholders. If it's true that, and I think it's disputed by the company and by the executive who was leaving, that the CEO or the founding shareholder is able unilaterally to make that kind of decision, that's a downside to dual class. And I mean, I can't say the board has a lot of power in a situation like that, but it points up some of the negatives, some of the problems of managerial accountability with a dual class stock. And to the extent that Sergey was just thinking about selling anyway, and Larry is sort of faded a little bit into the background of running the company. It's not so obvious what their vision and their sense of the long-term interests of Google and the other stockholders is that warrants having the disproportionate control.
Bloomberg's Mark Bergen and George Washington University's Lawrence Cunningham. Still ahead, NASA is aiming to put astronauts back on the moon by 2024. How Trump's 2020 budget request supports its lunar mission. Next. This is Bloomberg. NASA is speeding up its moon exploration. President Trump delivered his 2020 budget proposal to Congress Monday, requesting $21 billion for the agency to fund NASA's Moon to Mars program. The effort prioritizes lunar missions as the agency looks to transport humans back to the moon and eventually Mars. And the private sector will be an important part of this exploration. Space Angels CEO Chad Anderson joined us to give us his perspective on the space race. Space Angels is a network of angel investors focused exclusively on early-stage commercial space ventures.
The budget's out and it really emphasizes the moon over everything else. I think that the administrator said very clearly that this is a stepping stone. So the moon is seen as a staging area. It's a place for us to test out the technology that we need to go to Mars. And that is still the horizon goal, but the moon is much closer. It allows us some big wins early on and allows us to develop the technology that we'll need to go to Mars eventually.
Is there anything in particular that we will learn from the moon itself, though, that we don't already know, as opposed to deep space exploration, which arguably, there's more to know?
What it allows us to test the technology that we're going to use to go to Mars. So as investors in this space economy, it's really important that NASA is going to be partnering with the private sector in a much bigger way. And that was the highlight of the announcement today. And so there's a number of companies that are working to put a lunar gateway in the orbit of the moon that's going to allow us to do a number of different things. One, it's going to help develop the launch sector that's going to go out farther beyond just low Earth orbit. It's going to allow us to develop the landing technology to go from orbit into the surface. And in addition, there's a number of companies that are already working on technology that's being funded by CLPS, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, that's $2.5 billion over the next 10 years. That's funding a number of small and medium-sized landers that are going to go directly to the lunar surface. So what this allows us to do is really test out the landing technology and the technology that we need to sustain a presence around another planetary body. And in addition, the moon acts as a fantastic launch point to go out into deeper space missions. There's the gravity environment on the moon is much less, and so to be able to launch from the moon to deeper space is much easier.
Now, we often focus on SpaceX, which is working towards getting a human into space for the first time since NASA paused the space program. But what are these other smaller companies that are playing a critical role here that we need to know about?
Yeah, so there was $300 million set aside for the larger human landers. That's the type of thing that SpaceX and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin are developing, these larger landers to take the humans. But to get started, this $2.5 billion that I mentioned earlier for the CLPS program, that's going to smaller companies as well. So Astrobotic, which is showing on your screen, is a company that is privately funded, has been working with NASA and developing a relationship over a number of years, and is a key player in this CLPS program that's going to allow them to allow NASA to deliver payloads to the moon for the first time in a very long time. And what this is going to be is to test the capability, but also to lay the initial infrastructure that's going to allow for a habitat on the surface of the moon, which looks very similar to, let's say, the space station that as it is today, with a rotating crew of people that are there on a sustained basis, and we have a continuous human presence there.
Space Angel CEO Chad Anderson there. And that does it for this edition of the Best of Bloomberg Technology. We will bring you all the latest in tech throughout the week. Tune in every day, 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco, and Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology and follow our global breaking news network TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.